All right. Hello, everyone. We are Team Flex. I'm Teddy. To my right is Percy. To my left, we have Miles and Mia. We, in the course of the semester, conducted 108 interviews. You can see here the evolution between our original and our final problem statement. The main difference between the two problem statements is that in the final problem statement, we pinpoint 3 reasons behind the poor DoD acquisition practices. The first being inflexible funding, the second subpar market research/outreach, and finally inflexible contracting requirements. Next slide, please. After initial research, we came up with an initial problem diagram. A problem or requirement is identified and the solutions are submitted to Congress, who then allocates the funds to those solutions. However, the allocation of funds can be a very lengthy process, during which time a better solution is often discovered. There are currently no means to flexibly reallocate funds to these better solutions, leading to the DoD having outdated technology. Next slide, please. So we talked to 4 main groups of people, the first of which, private businesses, made up about half of our interviews. Our main goals while interviewing private businesses was to figure out how to make the DoD a more attractive customer. Next slide, please. We also talked to acquisition organizations, which made up about a quarter of our interviews. They gave us guidance whether there was potential avenues of success or just new people we could talk to. Next slide, please. We also talked to warfighters, who made up about 15% of our interviews. We just thought it would be helpful to get their perspective as the actual users of the tools. Next slide. And finally, we talked to Congress, who made up about 10% of our interviews. We wanted to get a better understanding of the congressional funding process, as well as how we could get general congressional support behind our issue. Next slide.
So the current acquisition system puts the U.S. at a technological disadvantage and disrupts the relationship between the DoD and private industry. And so this means that we are at a specific risk to rising threats like China. Slide. We focused our initial research on the congressional allocation and funding process, typical DoD acquisition process, and issues on all sides of the table. So this would include the perspective of small businesses, startups, and larger primes. Slide. Going into week 3, we developed the idea of an intermediary organization, which would catalog commercial products and try and match those with different DoD needs. So this would shift the burden off of companies who would have to reach out to the DoD. So now that we were shifting the burden off of the companies. Slide. The issue with that was that it added another layer of bureaucracy to the process. So in week 4, we wanted to take out the office and replace it with an artificial intelligence. But we realized that there was another problem because the business language didn't necessarily correlate with the government language. And so it would make it difficult to search through that database. Slide. Going into week 5, we narrowed the problem a bit. We wanted to shift the hourly payment structure, which encourages companies to lengthen contracts in order to make a profit, and return the focus back onto developing the technology itself, which would hopefully encourage efficiency and timeliness. Slide. In week 6, we incorporated this into a larger MVP, which included increased flexibility of funding allocation, as well as the AI database, and a consortium model based on smaller scale successful programs already in the DoD. Slide.
So as the course wrapped up, our team had the opportunity to visit Air Combat Command over in Langley. We were able to have 15 interviews with warfighters, operators, and people who were in the acquisition system. So we were able to go to Air Combat Command, and we had 2 missions that we wanted to get done. 1, we wanted feedback on our current MVP, and 2, we wanted to understand people's problems with the acquisition system as it currently stood. Slide. So after we came back from Langley, our team came together, and as Teddy mentioned before, we looked at our problem again, figured out that we could boil this down to really 3 distinct parts. 1, the inflexible allocation of money. 2, poor communication between the DoD, businesses, and the operators of the actual technology. And 3, just the slow contracting process that was tedious for everybody involved. Slide. So then we took another step back. How does this look from a business's angle? So I want everybody in here to quickly imagine a customer that is awful at communication, that doesn't provide you the payments on time and in a timely manner, and does not give you enough information for next steps. And that's if they don't like your product, or even if they do like your product. To a lot of businesses, that would be their worst customer and the most annoying customer to work with. So that's what the DoD is to a lot of these businesses. The DoD is unclear in their communication, unclear in next steps, and is really slow when it comes to contracting with these small businesses. So a lot of businesses have to ask this question: is it worth it to work with the Department of Defense? Unless they have a massive contract that they're looking at, the answer is often no, it's not worth it. Slide. So before I hand it off to Mia to talk about our minimum viable product, a quick word on pivot. As Percy mentioned before, we went through several different iterations on our minimum viable product. each with its own unique twist and each change as we sort of learned about this process even more, and as we got more familiar with the acquisition process. But a lot of the minimum viable products that we came up with were either not feasible, were not scalable, or did not have enough documentation where we could hand it off to somebody else or another organization and they could sort of execute on the plan that we had. That being said, we believe that our current minimum viable product solves a lot of these problems and can be scalable, feasible, and can be handed off to another organization to help move this forward as we transition from just creating an MVP to handing it off to another organization. And now I'll hand it off to Mia to talk a bit about our minimum viable product.
Yeah, so after weeks of interviews and lots of pivoting, as Miles mentioned, we landed on our current minimal viable product, which is divided into 4 parts, the specifics of which I'll get into, starting with an increased sense of urgency slide. So China has become an increased security threat, whether it be the Uyghur genocide, the risk of Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or China's recent test of a hypersonic missile. Friction continues to build between China and the US. And if this tension were to ever culminate in conflict, the US would be at great technological disadvantage due to the inefficiencies that exist in its acquisition system, especially in comparison to Chinese military acquisition, which has a streamlined connection between government and commercial sectors. We want to increase the sense of urgency about the detrimental effects a slow and inefficient acquisitions process can have negatively on national security. And we want to capitalize on this kind of growing awareness that exists about this potential threat of China, which we can see in recent political events like the diplomatic boycott of the Olympics. And we want to do this through publishing 2 op-eds targeted at both expert communities and the general public, just illustrating this potential threat of China. Next slide. The second aspect of our MVP is more flexibility in congressional funding authorizations. We want to make the descriptions that go along with congressional funding authorizations more general as opposed to specific, to give program managers more flexibility and freedom. If a program decides that they want to pivot their research, more flexibility in funding authorization would allow them to transfer their current funding as long as the end goal remained the same, instead of having to re-enter the budget cycle, which can take upwards of 2 years. This also operates within the current buckets of money system, meaning that Congress continues to hold the majority of the authority in the funding authorization process. However, this would also give program managers more authority, which we understand that Congress may not be a big fan of. So to combat this, we want to start small with a pivot, with a pilot program that extends this flexibility to a small area and delivers results which we can use as credibility moving forward. Next slide. The third aspect of our minimal viable product is market outreach and flexible contracting. We want to improve market outreach through better utilization of existing databases such as Golden, which is an online venture capitalist marketplace, or new programs such as Vulcan, which is an innovation scouting platform that uses GovCloud to build these tech bridges that connect the DoD with local businesses all around the globe. We want this market outreach to be both continuous and prior to the requirement writing in acquisition process, to allow for initial proposals and programs to be the best that they can be, but to also allow room for additional discovery along the road, because as we mentioned, this is a pretty lengthy process. And this would require contracts and requirements to adjust to innovation to ensure that programs are always working towards the development of a most valuable solution. Next slide. The fourth aspect of our MVP is to alter success metrics of research grants. We want a project to be deemed successful if these 3 elements are met, and if they're not, we would also require program managers to explain why these elements weren't met. As it stands, current success metrics rely solely on whether a technology makes it to the field. And these altered success metrics would allow a project to be deemed somewhat successful even if all the elements aren't met. So it just improves the chances of projects being deemed not a total failure, which is good for small businesses. Next slide. Having described our MVP, moving on to deployment, we plan to deploy our MVP through 3 pieces of literature. The first being a white paper and policy memo that are targeted towards our congressional contacts, as well as local representatives, and potentially the Alliance, which is a small business advocacy group. And as I mentioned before, we plan to publish 2 op-eds targeted at both expert communities as well as the general public. And we plan to distribute them through media outlets that target those specific audiences as well. Next slide. This is just a more descriptive timetable of our deployment for the next year, which we can kind of gloss over. So next slide. Moving on to our mission model canvas, most of this has been highlighted over the course of our presentation, but just to kind of reiterate some important points for buy-in and support. For our deployment, congressional support, the support of private companies, including primes and small businesses, Paternal service officers within the acquisition, as well as media outlets, are key sources of support that we need to move forward with our deployment effectively. Slide. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation. If you have any further questions about our MVP or want to help us or aid us in our deployment of our MVP, please contact us.
Okay, with that, we'd like to open it up for a few minutes to the broader audience. If you have any particular questions, if you'd like to sit there and consolidate and go over the screens. These are your tethered goats for the next 5 minutes or so. So please, any particular questions you have for the team, the approach, their efforts, the process itself, or specifics about the minimum viable product. By the way, if you would like to ask a question, if you're familiar with the raise hand function on the Windows computer, I believe it's Alt-Y, it's Option-Y, if you have a Macintosh device. If you know where the web controls are, there's a little raise hand function, and then I can see that on the screen. If that doesn't work, just start shouting at me and I'll answer. Yeah. Any questions? And Dennis, can you give me a good sound check? Am I still coming through loud and clear?
If you're coming through, sir.
Okay, thank you. All right, any questions?
Yes, I have a question for the team.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned in the presentation that one of the things you thought about was potentially granting new acquisition authorities to program managers. I'm curious if in your research, if you identified if there's any existing acquisition authorities that are perhaps underutilized that maybe could be expanded without having to create new authorities.
So we did, our problem sponsor is actually from an organization called AFWorks, which focuses on the acquisition network for the Air Force and bringing in new, reliable, cheaper products for the Air Force. So that would be a potential organization that, if given more funding and more eyes, could definitely help out this problem.
I'll also add that something we came across a few times was OTAs or other transaction authorities. And we found out a lot of businesses found that this was an easier way to get onto contract with the Department of Defense. But there was also, it's a bit of a gray area. The OTAs are supposed to be used for if you're prototyping something for the first time, versus a lot of acquisition authorities and program managers are looking to have something and just basically bring it into the Department of Defense and not necessarily just focus on the research side. So there are other avenues, but not a plethora of great options out there.
Thank you.
Max, was that you that answered the question? Asked that question?
Yeah, it was.
Okay. Okay. Any additional questions for the group?
Hey, this is John Vona from ACC. I have a question or a comment.
Thanks, John.
So I really like the deployment strategy. I guess, the only comment I would have, seems like a good initial deployment strategy. And I've seen many of these different efforts in acquisition reform have great interest early on in the process. But I think also the idea of capturing metrics and communicating over and over again to some of these different parties about how successful an effort is being or not being, because we have a tendency to walk away from anything that isn't innovative. So just a thought there in terms of how to make it the thought of how do we measure it and bring it forward to be a more permanent solution, because it takes a lot of convincing. Just a thought. Over.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Will,
awesome presentation, really great job. My question is, as you start to look at championing this beyond this initial stage, what do you think the biggest challenges are as you try to move up that hill?
Yeah. So since we are looking to publish material, I think the biggest issue we run into is finding avenues to publish that in. Like specifically newspapers, just different sorts of media outlets. We haven't written them yet, but we are in the process of writing them. So getting them out there will be a challenge because we haven't necessarily made those connections yet.
Yeah, just to add on to that, just generally speaking, a lot of our deployment, if you remember the timetable that kind of laid out more specifics of what our deployment may look like, there were arrows that were just they kind of meant to show how a lot of our deployment depends on our initial response. And so we expect it to be a lot of hits and misses as well. Just we've experienced that just in the interview process where there were a lot of cold calls that didn't come through, and we expect to see those same issues moving forward. And it's just about kind of repeating this cycle of putting ourselves out there, gauging the response, and then acting accordingly given that information.
Okay, all right. With that, for the interest of time, if you got additional questions, please send in the chat. We'll get those answers back to you. But Team Flex, great job, and I want to see that flex. There you go. All right.